and several of those would end up in the West, where they could be examined by people like me, and now by you. These T-34s were largely built in factory number 183, that was a tractor factory in the Ural Mountains, which produced around 50% of all Soviet T-34s during the war. We'll get onto why that is relevant in a bit. Now, first things first, because I know a lot of people are going to bring this up. T-34s tested by the Americans. Specifically, the report generated by the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Now, many will dismiss this as a source because the Americans had not been properly trained on the maintenance of a T-34, so they claim. So when the engine collapsed during trials, it was often blamed on the fact that the Americans had not correctly oiled the engine filters, forgetting, of course, that the T-34 supplied to the Americans for testing was one that did not have the later model Cyclone filters. Those were the ones that needed to be oiled. The Americans also had a Soviet engineer who actually wrote the report, who was with them during the trial and was explaining how to properly handle and maintain the tank. This trial has a lot of misconceptions surrounding it, and it's very often disregarded by fans of the T-34 and commie boos alike. We are not going to ignore it, and they are going to hate us for it. Good for them. You see, the confusion for most is the design of the T-34, outside of some flaws, which we'll get into later, is actually quite good. It's fairly robust, and for the period, a pretty advanced design. However, the plans and production notes of the T-34 are at best hypothetical. This is hypothetically the standard to which a T-34 should have been built, but during the war, absolutely no T-34s were built to the standard, and that is where the problem lies. Not in design, but production quality. And this is where you get the arguments. From people who do all their research exclusively online, have seen the plans, the hard factors described in the side column of Wikipedia, the testimonies from Germany's top commanders, and the propaganda issued by the Russians. It becomes very easy to see why this tank is a war winner, versus those of us who have actually seen a war production T-34. And I don't mean from behind a rope in a museum. So that argument from either side depends on if you believe we should judge the T-34 based on its actual intended design, or if we should judge it on the T-34 that was actually built and served in the Second World War. Now, funny enough, this argument becomes very easy when we're talking about British tanks. The Crusader is a tank famed for its mechanical reliability issues, which is blamed on its design. It is in fact a relatively good design for a tank, though not really setting any benchmarks. It did offer a solid medium tank, combining good armour and a decent gun with an absolutely ferocious speed. But because of what was going on in Britain at the time, the actual production models which entered service were far below in quality than what they should have been, leading to many mechanical reliability issues that historians will exclusively talk about when glossing over the African campaign so they can start talking about more exciting things like Stalingrad. Now, thankfully, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and real estate in Germany became very cheap. And in the 90s, Western historians were allowed into Russian archives for the first time, albeit briefly, up until Putin, where it became illegal to depict the Great Patriotic War in any way that was considered untrue. And who decided what was true and what was not? Putin did. And to a larger extent, the Russian government, meaning if they say the T-34 is the most amazing tank ever built, then it was. And if you wish to say otherwise, well, I'm sure the Gulag commander will be happy to pass any complaints you have along to the relevant authorities. But during that period of history, we get a lot of insight into the T-34's production and find that the Russians themselves and the Russian government had major concerns about the problematic T-34. But let's talk about that later. I've been talking for a while now and I've yet to actually say anything, so let's dive into the meat of this issue. But first, I need to retcon something. This won't take long, trust me. For the purposes of this video, I am going to be ignoring the year of 1941, and I want to explain why. 1941 sees the introduction of the T-34 in its earliest production variant. The Russians experience fairly high losses, losing about 20,000 tanks in this first year alone, of which 2,300 were 34s, which supposedly the Germans were unable to counter. This fact is often used by Veribus to justify that the 34 was only good in large numbers, as the reason often given for the poor initial performance of the T-34 was that it was only available in small numbers and encountered in small pockets of like 1 or 2 across a wide front. This is of course utter nonsense. Russia had just over 2,000 operational T-34s and would produce another 2,300 of them in the opening months of Barbarossa alone. They were used en masse from day one. You see, a lot of documentaries and stuff like to portray this idea that as the Germans advanced, they beat only these super outdated Russian tanks like the T-26 and the BT series, and it was only later that the more advanced models make an appearance to the shock of the German commanders. Ooh. This is not true. They were fighting KVs and T-34s on literally day one of Operation Barbarossa, en masse as well. The high rate of loss number was a multi-factor issue, but largely down to the fact that the second Operation Barbarossa started, Soviet logistics completely collapsed. Russia was producing more than what it needed in terms of equipment, but the reason you hear tales of Russians wearing boxes on their feet because they had no boots, or the famous enemy at the gates line,
"The one with the rifle shoots! 1 out of 2 gets a rifle! The one without follows him! When the one with the rifle gets killed, the one who is following picks up the rifle and shoots!"
It was not because they didn't have enough rifles for everyone, but because they just couldn't get them to the front lines in time. Logistics was second to everything else and would often be dictated down to as an afterthought. Men in tanks had priority, and it seemed to have almost been forgotten that men in tanks also need food, fuel, and ammunition. So early T-34s in the front line, though they were shipped in record time, would typically not be supplied with armor-piercing ammunition, or too little fuel, or no spare parts, meaning that they were quickly abandoned by their crews when they inevitably broke down, ran out of ammo, or ran out of fuel. The Soviets also had a bit of a lack of engineering vehicles like tractors, so when a tank was lost or abandoned, it could not be recovered. That's why that loss number was so high, and why the Germans ended up capturing so many T-34s. By 1942, the Soviets had got their shit sorted out, so this is kind of where we're going to pick things up. Let's stick with those hard factors first, since they are the easiest for everyone to understand. We are told time and time again that the armor of the T-34 is legendary and pervious to everything because it was sloped. Amazing! What an epiphany the Russians had! Take the armor and tilt it slightly. Ooh! Amazing! Why didn't anyone else think of that? You know what, I'm gonna get onto that later, because we need to have a discussion. But you know, the people who say this kind of shit always have some sort of mathematical equation which shows angles and relative thickness and effectiveness, and they're like, oh my god, you guys, sloped armor doubles the thickness, guys, and then they always turn to this penetration table, which, look, I don't know, every one of those I see is different. I'll cover why in a sec. So, armor thickness. Let's talk about it. Probably most of you think that's very important, right? Wrong! You fools! It's not as important as you think it is. The reason these penetration tables are always so inaccurate and typically not regarded with any degree of absolute is because you can do a lot with steel to dramatically improve its toughness without necessarily making it thicker. Sloping is one such example. Another is casting. Casting something from a large single piece as opposed to welding lots of plates together gives you a huge advantage in armor protection without necessarily having to increase thickness and add a shitload of weight. Hence why the Matilda II with its 60mm of cast armor was shrugging off rounds from an 88mm like they were made of fucking paper. But a Cromwell with 80mm of flat plate armor, typically thicker armor, can't do that. Another way you can do this is heat treating, and this was pretty common. Now, without getting into the real technical aspects of metallurgy, for fuck's sake, laser pig, Jesus Christ. Basically, this gives added protection to steel against various forms of shock, like high impacts. Germany, Britain, America, fuck it, everyone was heat treating their metal just to make it that little bit more resilient to anti-tank rounds, and the Russians were no exception. The problem was that while every other country was heat treating up to about 300 Brunel, that's unit of measurement for heat treating, the Russians were heat treating up to 600 Brunel, making their steel exceptionally hard. good thing, right? No. Heat treating to such a ridiculous amount makes your steel, yes, incredibly strong, but also incredibly brittle, meaning a high-impact shot from a round would weaken the tank considerably, and often cause it to snap, especially along its weakest points, even if the round did not penetrate, which is why you'll often see pictures of destroyed T-34s with no penetration holes, but these large gaps around the joints, or these weird shattering patterns on plates like they've been hit by fucking lightning or something. The welding of the T-34 was known to be pretty weak, often just spot welded using inferior materials to make the joint. Had those joints been a little stronger, up to the same standard as the American-made Sherman, it might have fared a bit better, but when you use inferior, badly made steel, poor welds, and thrown together by peasant farmers in a mountain who you threaten to shoot if they don't meet their production quotas, then you end up with a tank that any severe impact will cause it to disassemble itself like a piece of fucking flat-packed IKEA furniture, which is why you see a lot of damaged T-34s with bits missing or mismatched road wheels. Any impurities in the steel, any bad welding, a single solid smack onto the front of the tank will just rip that shit right off. It would also explain that in spite of the armor being sloped, which can apparently bounce any shot fired at it,
the T-34's armor is designed to deflect incoming rounds, in particular, deflect incoming rounds that come from straight to the front. So a round is coming towards a T-34, and it hits any of the angled deflecting surfaces on it, then it will ricochet off to the side.
The Russians lose 6,600 T-34s, more than Germany had tanks in total in 1942, when the Germans allegedly don't have anything which can counter it outside of the 88mm. The book Soviet Casualties and Combat Losses in the 20th Century, which was compiled by historians in Moscow using Soviet data, concluded that 54.3% of all T-34s in 1942 had been destroyed by the Panzer III. The so-called inferior tank, which could theoretically not penetrate the frontal armor of the T-34 without special ammunition, in spite of it doing it with an almost alarming regularity. But that's not the biggest reason other nations didn't heat treat beyond 300. The biggest reason was armor spalling. You see, when you have steel heat treated to such a ridiculous amount, you do occasionally get the problem that a high force of impact, though not penetrating the tank or even really causing any damage to it, will cause spalling. This is where tiny flakes of steel shoot off in random directions around the inside of the tank, turning the crew into a character from Hellraiser. This was a huge issue in T-34s and was still a problem even in the later post-war models that were found in East Germany after the wall came down, which were 1946 model T-34s, still had this issue. It is estimated, now this is just an estimate, that the armor spalling counted for nearly half of all T-34 crew fatalities, and why the average chances of survival for a T-34 crew after the tank was hit was about 15%. In the Sherman it was 80%.
Oh, the speed! The speed!
From the offset, the T-34 is designed to be fast. Its predecessor, the BT series, were some of the fastest tanks available at the time of their constructions, and Russia had purchased models of the Christie suspension simply because it allowed for that greater speed, even if the design was a technological dead end, which they were fully aware of. On that point, a lot of documentaries like to state that the Americans rejected the Christie suspension because they somehow saw it as a fool's errand. They were actually very interested in purchasing the Christie suspension, but unfortunately J. Walter Christie was such an asshole that no one in the American government could work with them, and they rejected it on those grounds. Not because, they could see it as pointless. Shut the fuck up, Freedom Booze, you don't get away easily. But like many Meacham tanks on the Allied side, the 34 is built to be fast and is built to fire on the move, allegedly. But does it? Why am I asking you this? You don't fucking know, do you? Alright, sorry, I won't be mean. Hypothetically, the T-34's V2 500 horsepower engine, pretty good engine by the way, should be able to deliver 25 kilometers per hour, that's 15 miles per hour to my American friends, on rough ground at about 53 kilometers per hour, or 33 miles per hour, on solid smooth ground. In theory. In reality, the tank's god-awful spur-clash gear transmission, combined with its dry clutch and its 4-speed gearbox, gave the tank a top speed of 15 kilometers per hour, or 9.3 miles per hour. even on smooth roads. This was not because the tank couldn't achieve those speeds, but because transitioning from second to third gear required an extreme amount of force on the part of the driver to achieve, while transitioning into fourth required superhuman strength and would more than likely break the gear lever if attempted, hence why T-34 drivers carried hammers. No, that is not a myth, shut up. The gearbox problem, combined with the constant need to shift and change gears in combat, meant a heavy load was often placed on the rather weak transmission, which would break with such an alarming regularity that 34s would often carry a spare transmission with them into battle, in a box on the back. In 1943, a new model T-34 with a 5-speed gearbox was developed, which helped alleviate this problem. However, even by 1955, half of all T-34s produced, even the 85 variant, would still have the 4-speed gearbox. Even then, those that had the 5-speed gearbox could only hit a maximum of 30 km per hour, that's 18 miles per hour, cross country. The reported 53 km per hour top speed is purely theoretical, making the T-34 remarkably slow when compared to other Allied tanks. Now, I have a confession to make. I, Laserpig, used to be a Teaboo. As a recovering Teaboo, even during my avid defense of the Crusader tank, don't worry, not a video I'm going to make anytime soon, I have to admit that the Christie suspension is not very good. And tanks which were built with it suffered as a result. I mean, for all the benefits of speed it gave you, the cross-country performance was shit. It was shit, I'm sorry. The stability was awful. The British tried to improve this by introducing a number of additional features, turret stabilization, pivoted guns, huge shock absorbers. The Russians didn't. So while the Crusader enjoyed a fairly high level of accuracy while firing on the move, the T-34 did not. Tests conducted by the Germans showed it to have the worst stability of any other tank tested, outside of extremely early variants of the Panzer IV, giving it the capability to actually hit anything while firing in the move, as being on par to my ability to walk past a bake sale. I fucking love bake sales, shut the fuck up. This was later backed up into individual tests, one performed by the Americans, and then one performed by the Russians, hence why both the T-34M and the T-44, the proposed replacements for the T-34, use a torsion bar suspension instead, something the British would take a bit longer to figure out. Fuck's sake, guys.
天上太阳红呀红彤彤儿，心中的太阳是毛泽东儿。
Like everything else in the T-34, it looks good on paper, but is terrible in reality. Soviet tank guns suffered from low exit velocities and poor ranged accuracy, though in fairness, this was not due to the gun. This was due to the quality of the powder that they were using in the shells, which is why on paper, this gun can rip through panzers with the sheer raw power of stellanium, but in reality was about as effective as the next few seconds of this child's life against that thing. So, decent gun, shit shells. But while I'm here, we might as well. While the amateur may look at the T-34 and marvel at its gun for being long and therefore obviously superior, the gun had only a marginally higher velocity than the main gun of the Sherman. The later 85mm was comparable to the KWK-40 used on the Stug, though the accuracy of using anything outside of solid-shot AP ammunition was allegedly about 50-50 of it landing where you aimed, which somewhat explains Soviet battle tactics. Several stories would later emerge regarding Soviet tankers' refusal to use the supplied APCR ammunition due to its tendency to explode in the barrel if the gun was not left to cool after being fired, which was rather problematic when you were in a battle and you were trying to fire off as many shots as you could. Now, of course, you can take all of this with a pinch of salt. Penetration tables are typically not accepted as absolutes because they are gained from firing the gun under ideal conditions, with ideal ammunition, at ideal ranges, against solid sheet metal, and as we learned previously, casting, welding, sloping, and heat treating are all ways you could increase armor protection without necessarily increasing the thickness. Yes, big guns shoot through rusty plate like it was paper, well done! The other problem, which I will admit to, is that most statistical sources on the T-34's gun performance do not differentiate between the L-11 and the F-43, and the ones that do are Soviet tank diaries, of which 2 out of the 5 I have read over the years I now know to be fake. At best, what I can say is that the gun of the T-34 is rather overhyped. Not a bad gun, but the people who marvel at it are the same people who call the Sherman's gun a pancake, only suitable for blowing up trucks and armoured cars, and those people aren't really worth bothering about. In video games, it's always the hard factors which typically matter, so people who take their history knowledge from video games do tend to walk away with a rather obscure idea of what a World War II tank battle actually entailed. I have often stated that tanks which excel in the soft factors, in spite of an underwhelming performance in the hard factors, tended to do better, and I stand by that. Whereby tanks that are good in the hard factors yet terrible soft factors do poorly. This was the paradox of the Panther tank, one of the worst tanks Germany ever produced, in spite of also being one of the sexiest. So we can say that the T-34 has terrible armour, god-awful speed, and an average at best gun. But are the soft factors where this tank becomes a war winner? No, it doesn't. Buckle your assholes, boys. This is gonna be a bumpy ride. Quite literally in terms of the 34.
Kazakhstan, greatest country in the world. All other countries are run by little girls.
The 34 has wide tracks, and in having wide tracks, it spreads its surface pressure out along a wider area. This makes it more advantageous at moving through soft ground in comparison to the German tanks, the favourite example being the Panzer IV, whose narrow tracks place the entire weight of the tank into a smaller area, causing it to sink quickly into the mud. Footage then often cuts to the Type 4s, which have specially fitted track extensions in order to try and alleviate this problem. And while this is true, many have interpreted this as the T-34 never got stuck in mud, whereas in fact it did, quite frequently. Notable publications on the T-34 as well as its Wikipedia entry somewhat missed this statement out in regards to the performance of the T-34, but incidents where a 34 got bogged down in the mud were almost as frequent as its German counterparts. The Tiger, for example, had wider tracks than the T-34, and with more road wheels, the Tiger's weight was spread out over 16 points of pressure as opposed to the T-34's 10, which in spite of being half the weight of the Tiger, actually gave it the same ground pressure per square inch. Ballpark numbers are 1 kg per centimetre cubed for both the Tiger and the 76, and 1.02 centimetre cubed for the 85, though people argue about these numbers all the fucking time. Zagula claims the 34 to actually be around 0.85 kilograms per centimetre cubed, and the Tiger to be 1.08, whereas Panzertruppen by Thomas L. Jentz, widely regarded as the best in his field, puts it at 0.74 for the Tiger. Of course, various publications and documentaries will find reasonable excuses as to why the Tiger does not have the same or better cross-country performance as the T-34, a casual admittance that other factors do contribute to driving through mud effectively, even if the impression given is that the 34 could somehow glide through the mud like it was fucking Jesus. The truth of the matter is rather simple. I'm going to tell you the secret right now, so listen. Tiger has interlocking road wheels. The gaps between them very easily fill up with mud, which, if thick enough or left in the sun to dry out, means that the wheels can very easily jam, giving the impression the Tiger has got stuck in the mud. Once the summer rains began and the mud turned into liquid Russia, the offences on both sides somewhat ground to a halt, though most documentaries write this off as Russia just taking a breather. They're not going to counterattack the Germans and all this heavy mud and ice. They could if they wanted, because the T-34 can just fly across the mud to safety anytime it wants, because apparently...
Put your hands together if you wanna clap as we take you through this monkey rap.
I did mention the 34 was a pretty well-designed tank. Here's where I contradict myself. The wine is kicking in now. Jesus fuck. A lot of people will look at the T-34 as the epitome of the sloped armour design and laugh at the other allied tanks for not knowing that sloped armour makes Nazi shells bounce off your tank like it was gliding through the fucking Matrix. The thing is, the benefits of sloped armour have been known since the 12th century, hence why on some castles you'll find these large stone sloping slabs that helps deflect cannonballs. So for those of you still suckling on your mother's teats thinking the T-34 was the first tank to have sloped armour, here are some pictures of earlier tanks with sloped armour. those of you with an IQ above that of a garden salad, you may have asked the question, why didn't the Allies design tanks with sloped armour? You see, the T-34, while being revered as having the sloped armour of the gods, is actually a very good example of both the benefits and flaws of a sloped armour design. The 34's profile is very low compared to other sloped armour designs such as the Sherman and the Panther, both of which are quite tall, and as you may suspect, there's a very good reason for this. T-34 is incredibly cramped. Even on the 85 variant, which is roomier than the standard 76, the crew would be crammed in against each other due to the heavily sloped front and sides, as well as its shorter profile and the Christie suspension, which was robbing the internals of most of its space. And this led to a number of problems. Driving the T-34 is exhaustive work. The ride is bad, being rammed up against everything inside as well as each other. By the time the crew got to battle, they were exhausted, as well as being quite bruised from being bashed around. The lack of room also meant that reloading the gun could be quite the challenge. Though the ammunition storage was surprisingly good, especially for a Russian tank, the average Russian crew under battle conditions could fire maybe 1 to 2 rounds per minute. Germans could fire 4 to 5. It also meant that supplies inside the tank were rather limited, so they would typically be stowed on the outside of the tank, which would often catch fire when hit or simply be destroyed during a battle. This meant that T-34 units would have to wait on supply convoys catching up with them, giving them less autonomy in comparison with the German units, who could carry sleeping rolls, food, water, as well as digging tools, spare parts inside the tank with them. There was an attempt to alleviate this problem by providing armoured storage units, which were these large boxes on the back, and you'll see a lot of them on models of the T-34 from 1942 onwards. The final problem, of course, was crew mortality rates. Getting hit by a penetrating shot would, on average, lead to the deaths of about 85% of the crew, and also meant that bailing from a tank that was on fire was almost an impossibility. These numbers were calculated based on averages obtained from experience of the T-34 in Korea. The Koreans, being on average shorter and smaller framed than the Russians, still found the tank incredibly cramped. There is one more problem with the T-34's design that I will touch on, outside of the terrible gearbox, the transmission units, the fact the hull gun didn't use smokeless cartridges, and the total lack of internal space to move around, and that was the fuel tanks. Unlike every other tank in the world, these were kept in the fighting compartment, with the crew. This is why you see so many pictures of the T-34 burnt out with their turrets missing, having apparently exploded. This is also another reason why crew mortality rates were so high. And yes, since I can picture you furiously masturbating into the comments, diesel does catch fire. Shut up. Now, there are a number of issues which many haters of the T-34 will attribute to design, but I feel it more fair to place under the category of manufacturing defects. I'm waving my hands around for the drama, but I'm forgetting you can't see me, which is a good thing, believe me. Now, information we found in the 90s is going to come in handy here. As I said, the T-34 design has its flaws, but is ultimately not bad, especially in comparison to a lot of other tanks around at the time. Two-man turrets were pretty common, British tanks also used the Christie suspension, and the driver of the early cruiser models couldn't escape unless the turret was at its zero position. German tanks were not stabilised to be able to fire on the move, and the French tanks were pathetically slow and fuel-hungry. And of course there's Italian tanks, and we all know about them. All tanks have their serious flaws, unless it's the Matilda II, which was glorious and had absolutely no faults whatsoever. Shut up! Don't fact check that! Trust me! Shut up! However, none of the above-mentioned tanks have a failure rate that can match the T-34, both in terms of just how often it would break down or be destroyed in battle. And why is this? The Germans would like you to believe that it's because the Russians were deployed in huge waves, that they sent hundreds upon hundreds of troops against the Germans until they just simply ran out of ammo. This is not true. The Russians would like you to believe that their huge losses on the Eastern Front was because the fighting was so intense, so brutal, so powerful, and generally epic, and absolutely nothing to do with their consistent tactical failures and poor chain of supply. No, of course not! Listen to how epic the suck is and shut up! T-34s were built badly. There's really no other way to describe it. To give you one example, many people will ask why early British tanks were